Hello and welcome. In this job explainer video, we're going to be taking a look at the date intervals job, which we can load at any time using the load example job as date, and then simply select from builder date intervals. So the main point of this job is to show how we can actually take date values, insert them into the database, and then publish them in builder forms. Now there's a few extra things going on with this form, but I don't want to complicate it too much at first, so let's just take a look at the core idea of inserting dates into the database and pulling them out in Builder. So to get started then, this demo job has 2 pages at the start that collect a date value. We also collect the username and date, but it's not really, data, it's not really important. We're really focusing on this due date field right here, and then we send them to the database using an SQL plus item. So let's take a look at how this works first. So the first key point whenever we're working with dates in RackForms is that a raw date value doesn't actually work for SQL. We actually need to have a timestamp or a date time value to insert into the database. And the way we do that in RackForms is by creating a calendar item and then making sure under calendar type, we selected one of these values that use a TS or DT. And of course this stands for timestamp or date time. Now we have 3 formats for them: American, European, and German. So TS and DT is the first important thing. The next thing that we need to do is in the SQL plus item, where we're actually going to write that date time or timestamp value, we need to make sure that we use the proper token. So in this particular case, calendar is the name of the field. And we can actually see that when we mouse over it, there's calendar. But instead of using the raw field name, as we would for, in this case, user and data, right, just to grab the text values right here, we actually want to use underscore DT for date time or underscore TS for timestamp. And it's really, really important that we do that. So calendar, the name of the field, and then either underscore DT or underscore TS. Now in most cases, we almost always want to use underscore DT, right? We almost never want to use timestamp. So with that done, if I run this form, I could select a username, let's say Steve2. Here's some sample data. And let me select a date, let's say the 24th, and I'll hit submit right here. If I look at my database, I can see now that I have a new record, Steve2, and it has that 10/24 date that I just selected from the select item. So great, so now we're inserting date values into the database. How do we actually pull them out? Well, if we go down to the last page of the job, this is our builder form right here. And the builder form then is selecting 3 columns from the database, and it's using some date interval logic. So it's a little bit compacted. So let's go ahead and copy this out and look at it in a SQL editor. So here's the query as we're running it in RackForms. Now to understand what's happening here, let's first run a raw query right here. So select name, email, and DT, so the datetime field, from FB demo where datetime is less than now, and datetime is also less than subtracting now minus 1 day. So this date sub now block right here, we can actually run separately right here, and we can actually see what this returns. So if I select now and then remove 1 day from it, because it's October 31st today, I'll get October 30th. So this block right here, this date sub, is simply saying select the datetime value where datetime is less than now, and it's also less than now minus 1 day. So that's what we run in the database, right? This is just regular SQL. The RackForm version only differs by one important detail. So here we're saying interval is 1 day, whereas here we're saying interval is actually equal to G and then this the 2 braces and the word interval in between it. So what does that actually mean? Well, this is a RackForms token. The G tells me that it's a get variable, and the get variable that's going to get is called interval. So when I run this query in RackForms, that is on this repeater module right here, I'm actually saying grab the value that's in my URL bar, and then that's going to be the interval value that I use. And we can actually see this in action now. If I run this form, I can see here that by default I return all results, but if I wanted to show records older than 10 days, I'd simply show records. I now have a get variable of interval, and its value is 10. Again, we're looking for a get variable of interval, And because it's 10, that's the value that's going to be run against the database. So if I were to replace this, for example, with a raw value, I would simply return these 3 rows. And of course, this is what we return here. Similarly, I could select 20 days, and I would get a slightly different set of results right here. So that is how that works. Now, that is the basic idea then of actually querying the data. The last thing is, of course, displaying it. And this demo job, because we have several ways of doing it, wants to try to show them all. So the first way is if I go to my token chooser right here, and I just put in, scoot this over here, the raw value of the token, that is just, I click this guy right here, I'm going to simply show the raw value from the database. And of course, that's exactly what I get, right? The raw timestamp. The next value, though, is this date formatted. So how does this guy work? Well, date formatted is actually coming from this right here. Now, if you've never used a function token before, we can simply select those from right here. And a function token simply means we're going to call a PHP function that we define, and as a value, we're going to pass that function the value from the row of the database. So if I call a function against DT, whatever row is being repeated over, that's the value you're going to pass to that function. So when I create this token, then I simply need to name the function. So this comes in as function name. I change this to format date, and everything else I can leave the same, right? So format date. Format date is defined right here, right? So we have to define the name of the function. So I've done that right here. And in this particular case, then I grab the date value, because again, we pass in the raw timestamp string, and then I format it as year-month-day. And of course, again, as we can see when we run this form, that's exactly what a year, month, day. So we then have 2 other types of formatting, and these are the automated ones. These are kind of like the more complex ways of doing it, but they're also really powerful because we can format a date any way we want, right? So I can put in minutes, seconds, use a timestamp, etc. The more common ways of doing this, though, are actually a little bit easier, and that is to simply click A or E for American or European. In other words, if I want the American formatted version of that date time value, I'd click A. If I wanted the European version, I'd click E right here. And when I do that, now we're actually formatting it automatically as this and this. So let's take a brief review of what we covered here. So the first thing that we needed to do is we needed to get a date into our database. And we did that by adding a calendar item and making sure that we selected one of the TS, DT values from the dropdown, timestamp and date time. We then used an SQL plus item to insert the calendar date field, that is this guy right here, but we made sure to append either an _DT or _timestamp so that we grab the date time or timestamp value. The reason why we do that is because in MySQL, we cannot insert a string value into a date time or timestamp field. We have to insert a specially formatted string, right? So that's what this does for us. If I want to insert the date time, I say _DT, and RackForms transforms the value that the user typed in right here into a valid MySQL datetime field. Now, generally speaking, if I ever want to work with dates, I always use the date time. So therefore, if you want to use this, I almost always suggest using _DT. Then when it came to the builder form, we had our SQL query. This is a little bit more complex, but all we're really doing is just returning some dates. And when I wanted to display that, I could display it as a raw timestamp by just using the raw token value. I could use a function token and actually perform the logic myself for formatting the date. Or I can use the automated methods of simply showing the American or European version formatted of that date. Finally, as a quick bonus, I just wanted to really quickly show one other thing about this form here, which is, as you may have noticed here, I actually have this little form that we can submit and show these different values. Now, in order to use this right here, in order to implement this, I actually wrote some custom PHP code for that. That is this code right here. Now this is totally optional, that's why I left it to the end, but I did want to show an example of how we can use custom PHP code in forms to create custom logic. The basic idea here is because I know I'm going to be working with a get variable, I create a variable called g, and then I issue a filter input against that input get string right there. So it's called interval, as you recall. I then create an array of values, 10, 20, 30, etc., that I use for my days, and then I issue a for each statement to essentially populate the select item right here that we've created so that my users can select one of these values. The reason why I'm using PHP code to do this is because I want to make sure that if a user selects 20 as their last value, that's the value that stays when I hit refresh on my data right here, right? So I don't want this to keep resetting. I'm going to make sure that it actually stays put with the value. So that's why I have a little bit extra code. Again, that is totally optional. The only reason I show it is because writing custom code for us developers is something we do all the time, and it's fully supported within RackForms. And this is one way that we can do that right within our builder templates. So hopefully this video has been helpful. Of course, if you have ever questions about working with dates or builder, please let us know at info@rackforms.com.